evening. Welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and answering your questions tonight. Comic Vince Sorrenti, Minister for Agriculture and Deputy Nationals leader Barnaby Joyce, criminal lawyer, author and former British Army officer Rabia Siddique, politician turned broadcaster Amanda Vanstone and Shadow Finance Minister Tony Burke. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. And as usual, we're being simulcast on ABC News 24 and News Radio. And you can join the Twitter conversation with the Quanda hashtag that's just appeared on your screen. Well, tonight, New South Wales is facing its worst bushfire crisis in 50 years. A state of emergency has been declared as authorities warn of a growing risk of a catastrophic megafire in the Blue Mountains. Major disasters like this always raise difficult questions about priorities for federal and state governments, and more recently about the links between extreme bushfires and climate change. Well, our first question tonight is on this subject. It's from Ted Jontek.
The Sydney Morning Herald today reported that cuts to staff and funding by the New South Wales government has largely dismantled the state's ability to investigate and prepare for the effects of climate change, such as the frequency of extreme fires. Do you think that governments are focusing too much on short-term fiscal policies at the expense of investment into long-term strategic policies?
Tony Burke, let's start with you.
There's always a battle. Getting the long-term issues up is always what the nation needs, and it's always the hardest part of any political argument. Specifically on the New South Wales government, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what they've been doing with their budgetary decisions, but certainly there's two things you always need to do at a time of natural disaster. You need to deal immediately with the crisis that is at hand and the human risk that's at hand. But then you also make sure you're doing the long-term actions as well.
Now, was Adam Bant being short-term or long-term last week when he tweeted Tony Abbott's plan means more bushfires for Australia?
I always worry when we take an individual event and use that as the example of climate change. Always worry about that. Climate change is about overall trends. And you can never pick the individual drought or the individual major weather event and say that one's a climate change. But you certainly know from all the scientific data that we have that we get more intense major weather events as a result of climate change. And I think there's an issue of timing with what Adam Bant said, but there's also an issue of making sure with the science that we're actually accurate about what the information is and that we deal with the data that's there. And I think that means we've got to be honest about trends rather than individual events.
Barnaby Joyce, I'll come to you next and then we'll hear from the non-politicians.
Well, it doesn't matter what you do in regards, a bureaucracy is not going to put out a fire. Hazard reduction, fuel reduction, fire trails, preparedness is obviously essential, but I don't see how a statement, an inflammatory statement by Mr Band is of assistance at this point in time, because every person who's lost their house is looking to the immediate future of how they get support and how they get looked after now. And I don't think they'd be, I don't think they'd appreciate someone playing short-term politics at this point.
What do you think about the climate change argument, though? Professor Andy Pittman today said that what we've seen in last week's fires is the signature of climate change, leaving Australia particularly vulnerable to fire.
Well, obviously, fires that we are seeing at the moment are not unusual at this point in time. We heard tonight on the ABC that this is something that happens about once every 10 years. What we are seeing now is a lot more people living in the areas where these fires are present. Even taking into account that the climate is changing, it works its way down to how are you actually going to deal with this? And if you say, well, the way I will remedy that situation is with a new tax, then that's just not going to work.
Vince Sorrenti.
Well, I agree that it's not a time for political point scoring, really. I mean, either by the Sydney Morning Herald there or by Adam Bant. It's a time to put fires out and save people's property and, hope people don't get killed. But it's a realistic part of living in this country. I mean, there's been fires every few years in this nation for, tens of millions of years. There's a definite pattern developing here. It's not something that happens out of the blue. Every year we get excited and try and blame some sort of new reason why these things occur, but they're a natural part of living here. We're not a native people, we're not a nomadic people. We choose to live in the bush or near the bush, so this is something we have to confront.
Rabia, Siddique?
In terms of the specific question of government funding for climate change research, I think it would be a great shame. And indeed, you know, the challenge for any government is balancing those competing priorities and interests. But I think it would be a great shame if reduction in funding or withdrawal of funding was to hamper and prevent further research in what is not only a hugely important issue to each and every one of us in this country, but everyone on the planet. I am no scientist, I'm no expert, but certainly in my short life, I can think of perhaps in the last 20 years how many more natural disasters, how prolific they've been all around the world. And I think it's an issue that touches and affects each and every one of us. So I think government should look beyond the fiscal year and their term and really should be reinforcing funding in issues that affect us all long term and our planet, of course.
Amanda Vanstone, what do you think? I mean, to go back to that question, the New South Wales government used to have 10 scientists working on the impacts of climate change. They had another team working on climate change adaptation. That's down to 3, pretty much in both categories. So they've lost most of their scientists.
Well, I don't think the scientists are going to put the fire out either. So I don't know that that makes a cracker of difference, frankly. I'd like to be a bit more direct about Mr. Bant. I think it's just disgraceful. Whenever there is a disaster of any sort, and in particular bushfires and floods, we have a long history in this country of pretty much being bipartisan about it. There will always be time when the disaster's over for a bit of finger-pointing about who did the wrong thing or didn't do what they should have done. And I'm sure when that time comes in relation to this bushfire, people will ask the Greens about their policies of burn back in national parks and that sort of thing. And I'd be interested to see what Mr. Bant has to say at that time. But when there's a disaster, the best thing is if you're not a player, if you're not there helping put the fire out or you're not organising for more money to go there, just shut up, keep out, let everyone get on with their job, and then you can have the debate after. So,
just by the way, just to pick up on your earlier point, are you saying that because scientists don't physically put out fires, they shouldn't listen to them? No, I'm not saying that.
There's a lot of hot air from scientists.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, why do you necessarily link the two? There still is a very bad fire in New South Wales. I don't see the relationship between that and any reduction that there may be in the number of scientists working on climate change in the New South Wales government.
But isn't that sort of like saying... I think the timing of what Adam Bant said, completely off. But in terms of can you ever link science to the actuality, like the scientists who do medical research aren't the ones conducting the operation. That doesn't mean they're not relevant to health. And in the same way, the scientists who are doing work on hazard reduction are relevant to the issues of future bushfires.
Sure, that's fine. I'm just saying it doesn't relate to this particular one.
We've got another question on this subject. I'll go to that. We can continue this discussion. Also, we've got people with their hands up, but we'll go to Zachary Harrison.
Why is it that a government made up of lawyers, business owners, accountants and professional politicians think they can ignore the advice of climate scientists who specialise in the topic and put the future of Australia at risk by abolishing a price on carbon?
Barnaby, Joyce.
I wonder why that one was coming to me. Well, the first part of that is there's only one accountant who actually is in the Parliament at the moment. The next thing is that it's not that you say a certain suite of people are going to have all the answers, another suite are not. We do have to deal with the issues that are before us, and we have to acknowledge that Australia acting by itself is not going to have make any difference whatsoever. What we were doing is, economically, we could prove that, is we were putting immense pressures on things where we had a strategic advantage, like the price of power. And because the premise of your question is we should put in the carbon tax, which one of its fundamental operative mechanisms is to put up the price of power. And in putting up the price of power, it fundamentally makes us uncompetitive. And you either have cheap wages or cheap power or no jobs. And you've got to make up your mind which one you want.
Vince.
Oh, let's burn more coal, mate. There's a buck in it for everyone. Burn more coal, get more greenhouse gas in the air, Earth heats up, people buy more air conditioners, need more power. Burn more coal. Everyone gets a little taste. Let's stay on this treadmill. You know, really, let's just keep on consuming and using up stuff and borrowing money we don't have and buying shit we don't need and impressing people we don't like. Let's keep going, consume.
And that's the end of the program.
Rabia.
Wow, Vince, how do I top that? My personal view is, whether you call it a carbon tax or whether you call it something else, we need to put a price on carbon. I see that as the only way, Zachary, that we can encourage and perhaps even economically force industry to start thinking about greener, more efficient energy. And I think our planet and our world and our children's world and our children's children's world depend on us to make that decision now. Amanda Vanstone.
Well, I think industry needs to try and work on being cleaner, there's no doubt about that, but I agree with Barnaby. Whatever Australia does is not going to make a difference to the world at large. So we need to try and work to get other people as well to move in this direction. And I don't think Australian governments should ever put Australia and Australian jobs at a disadvantage behind other countries. It's all very well if you're the one at the university or in Parliament, you've got a job, it doesn't affect you. The people are going to lose their jobs. You see, the thing about the economy is, when it goes bung, wealthier people sell some shares or the beach house. The not so wealthy lose their job, maybe lose their house. And so keeping Australia competitive so that people have got jobs is, I think, a prime role of government.
Our question's got his hand up. I'll go back to Zachary Harrison.
If a price on carbon doesn't actually change anything, you're talking about Australia, how it's so insignificant. Why is it China has obviously learned by example from Australia and Europe and decided to actually put a price on carbon and move towards a full price on carbon right across the country by, I believe, 2020? The world's largest polluter, looking at countries like Australia and the fact that the carbon tax has made practically no difference.
Do you want to cover that? Tony Burke.
I think when we talk about a cap and trade system, we spend a lot of time talking about the trading and the price part of it. But the most important part of it's the cap. The most important part of it is having a cap, a limit on how much you pollute. And the real difference with what's being proposed with the legislation that's coming forward is pollution becomes unlimited again. You no longer have a cap on it. And we can't pretend that the only people who are being affected is what's the impact happening on the economy right now, and completely disregard generations that follow. We've got the information, we've got the science, we are not naive about this. How on earth can we as a parliament pretend to be?
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
Look, I hear that once more, you've got to see this in context. The price of carbon in China is around about or less than $1. And in many instances, what we are seeing is the capacity to create a carbon credit comes from getting maybe 3 inefficient coal-fired power stations, and just by reason of technology and advancement, they turn them into one big new efficient coal-fired power station and say that is a move towards a more carbon-efficient economy. Otherwise, people would just call that's just advancement, technological advancement. And one of the things that brings people ahead, if we believe that the premise of social advancement is motivated by a tax, and that's a very peculiar way for us to do business. People generally get ahead by using their head, by just the general ingenuity of people wanting to create a better internal combustion engine or a better photovoltaic cell. But let's not get into the position where we say, well, the way I motivate you is to tax you. Otherwise, the motivation to everything you do will become a tax.
Can I just make the point that your direct action policy is involved in paying corporations money if they can come up with good ways to reduce emissions? Well, so that's the same thing, isn't it?
No, that's completely different, because one's the concept.
So you're paying them taxpayers' money to come up with ideas for reducing emissions.
Just let me finish. One is the process where it says that if you come up with an idea, there is a pool of money, $3.2 billion, and you have the potential to have access to it. And those who come up with the best idea is motivated by the benefit of attaining money, rather than saying we will now punish everybody. And of course, the people who you're trying to punish, you're trying to affect, is the coal-fired power station. They don't care. They just send it down the wire to Zachary and say, "Well, Zachary, mate, you'll pay it."
Why are emissions going down then?
Well, there's a whole range of reasons. Why are all our food manufacturing jobs and food manufacturing companies shutting down? Why are we losing so many of our manufacturing jobs in Australia? Because we're losing our strategic advantage. What was our strategic advantage in the past? It was power.
Okay, I'll tell you what, you want to quickly respond to that, Tony Burke, and then I'm going to move to our video.
I don't know if there's a way of quickly responding, but it's...
We'll give it a go.
I'm just incredulous to say that the big shift in competitive advantage is the issue of whether or not there's been a price on carbon. You look at the home electricity bill and you look at the extent to which a whole lot of other impacts have been affected there, but it wasn't the price on carbon that caused that. You have an entire portfolio, Barnaby, that is made up of levies for research to make sure that people could be more efficient in food production into the future. Now, we don't say that's making food more expensive, we say it's making things more efficient. And the whole idea of a cap and trade system is that we actually generate the efficiencies out of that. That's how it works. And if you're going to say, well, you should never tax something, the whole funding of your portfolio on the agricultural levies ought to go out the window tomorrow.
Well, Tony, it wasn't working very well for you, mate, was it? I mean, what is the advancement in our manufacturing industry that you can now show to the Australian people as an advantage of your policy?
All right, I'll tell you what, I'm going to cut that discussion there because we could go the whole program just on that issue. But we actually have another question on the bushfire issue. It's a video from Alan Lang in Oberon, New South Wales.
As long as homeowners can build or even rebuild in the most blatantly hazardous areas, we will continue to see the rise in the cost of premiums for the rest of us. Live amongst the trees if you wish, but why should the rest of us have to pay? Sometimes with brave firefighters' lives.
Sorrenti.
Yeah, I've said that before, actually. That is quite a... Well, it's an imposition on everyone, really. I mean, if we rescue someone for sailing across Bass Strait on his own just because he felt like doing it, you know, it's a huge cost to our Navy. It's the same kind of analogy here. But
is it just a matter of making sure everyone's insured or something different? Because if you're insured, then everyone just pays higher premiums if there's a problem.
Well, I'm sure the insurance companies will work out a way of not covering bushfires or whatever's in your area that they have to pay out on. It's a very difficult question. Look, I'd love to live in the bush. It's a beautiful environment. You have to accept the risk. You have to calculate the risk, and you have to understand that this has been going on for eons. It's a part of living in this country. So, yeah, be insured, and it shouldn't be a burden on everyone.
Amanda Vanstone.
I have some sympathy with the person who spoke on the video.
I understand, by the way, that he has actually stripped out the trees from a very long distance away from his house.
Well, he's getting prepared, looking after his house, his kids, pets, whatever. I mean, there are people who just don't listen about how far away they need to have clearings, what they need to have with their gutters, the water supply they need to have. They get carried away with the idea of living in the bush. And it's not just that we all pay in terms of money. As Vince said, some people lose their lives fighting these fires. And so I think really we should look at perhaps, state or local government planners for allowing that sort of thing to happen. I don't know that we should say, Vince, well, if you want to do that, fine, take the risk, because we're humans and we just can't let them take the risk. We have to send people in there to try and save them. They force us to do that. So I think the planning laws need to be looked at. And if I may, I think that the Commonwealth Criminal Code, if it hasn't yet been sorted out in relation to bushfires, should be. And if it's not, if you can't be charged with manslaughter for lighting a fire, you should be able to, or murder. And the penalties for fire lighting should be far, far higher than they are, because, you know, you take lives when you do this. It's not just a game. It's not just some matches. Someone who's a bit upset lights a fire. It's a very, very serious thing to do, and I don't think we've taken it seriously enough.
So what about manslaughter for someone throwing a cigarette out a window?
Well, gee, I don't know that you'd be able to show the intention. But look, I think the penalties should be looked at by experts in the field and see what they can do, because it's just happening too often that people, you know, I feel a bit sorry for kid 11 that's been charged over this, but equally you have to say, well, you know, the parents should know what the kid's doing. You can't just have people setting fires and say, oh, gee, that was bad luck.
Tony Burke, let's go back to the question, and the subject was really about where people build their houses and should they build houses amongst trees in areas vulnerable to bushfires. And we just heard a suggestion from Amanda Vanstone there should be laws preventing that from happening.
I just don't know how in one breath we're saying what Adam Bant said in talking about climate change at the same time the people losing their homes is horrific. And now we can talk about law and order and blaming where people live, and that's all fair game. Like, I, for the life of me, don't understand how just because it was a member of... Like, I don't think he made the comments at the right time. But I just don't see how all of a sudden all these other policy areas are fine to criticise people for where they live, fine to criticise what the criminal law ought to be, but it's not okay to talk about climate change. You've either got a rule where you say during the disaster we'll deal with the disaster, which is what the entire panel was saying only minutes ago, or you don't. But you don't have one rule when you want to criticise a Green and another rule when you want to talk about law and order.
Yeah, but that was the question the guy asked, though.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that's how you...
Hello?
No.
It's about opening up discussion around...
We didn't lead the
I
topic.
personally don't think there should be censorship on what you can and can't talk about, even when there's a bushfire. But let's hear from Barnaby Joyce.
Can I just say, I think there is a difference between what appeared to be an overt political opportunism and having a policy discussion about a whole range of issues. There is a difference.
Barnaby Joyce.
What I love about government is you try to talk as little as possible, while in opposition you try to talk as much as possible.
Actually, that's interesting how your government talks very little now.
I didn't realise
there's a philosophy behind it.
Well, of course, because you're the government. You don't need to influence yourself. You know, that's your job.
What if people want to ask? What if people want to ask you serious questions and you?
I beg your pardon. That's what you're supposed to say. Now, in answering your question, I think that you can't. Obviously, there are things that you do that reduce the abundance of fuel around your house. Now, if you remove the trees from around your house, if you keep the grass fuel and you keep it either green or keep it mowed, if you clean your gutters. Then you've got a better chance. You don't remove the risk, but you've got a vastly better chance than if your house is surrounded by trees, surrounded by leaves. Quite obviously, it's just the nature and the chemistry of fire, and that you're creating a fire risk. So, what we have to understand that. If we really are fair income about reducing the fire risk around people's houses, we have to reduce the fuel load, and that's that.
What do you think about Amanda Vanstone's argument that you should actually create a new set of laws to stop people living amongst trees?
Well, I don't think.
To be fair, I didn't go that far. I said the planning, we can always put things into black and white and either extreme. What I said is I think the planning people need to have a very good look at what they're allowing, and just be sure that that is consistent with people being safe if a bushfire's in that proximity, to the best extent they can. And when you drive around some places, especially in Sydney, it's not obvious that that's happening.
Well, it's and in certain instances, especially with camphor laurel trees, they are just primed for a massive fire risk if they are near your house, because it is the nature of the oil content in them. So I don't think it's saying anything profound to say that if combustible material is removed from the proximity to your house, you're reducing your fire risk.
And Rabia, Siddique, just briefly on this, you've been listening to the arguments. I mean, there are two ways of dealing with this, I suppose. You can let people live as they do and suffer the consequences, and everyone pays the insurance premiums, they get higher and higher, or you can institute a new set of laws as to how people live.
Well, last time I checked, we still lived in a country where you could choose where you lived, and I would like to think that that is still the case. But I think living amongst the bush, or living in the bush and amongst trees, does bring with it some responsibility. And that's not only an individual responsibility to yourselves, but to your neighbours and your community as well. I think there is a place for perhaps local councils and planning laws. But in terms of law and order, I think we're enough of a nanny state at the moment. I think we have enough laws controlling how we live, what we do, what we say, and how we do it. So I wouldn't go further and say that there's a place for law and order in that.
We have some of the strictest fire codes in the world when it comes to buildings, from my time as an architect.
Yes.
We didn't have atriums in this country till the mid-1980s, like decades afterwards. But when it comes to the bush, I think, maybe there is something to be looked at there.
Let's move along. The next question comes from Roger Coleman on a very different subject. Sorry to those who had their hand up. We've got to move on to different...
Right. This is a question for Barnaby Joyce, and it's to do with what you're going to do for the 23 million people in Australia in terms of giving them good career choices for the future. You're about to sign a free trade agreement with China, one of the worst violators of free trade and contract law in the world. Now, I take you back to the agreement you signed in 2005 with Thailand. Now, between 1988 and 2005, we exported more than we imported from Thailand. From that date and now, they export more than three times as much as we import. Now, the question I've got for you is, do you guys really know what you're doing when you enter these free trade agreements? And are you shutting Australia down?
Barnaby Joyce.
Well, Roger, first of all, I acknowledge that with the Thai free trade agreement, there were problems, especially the way that the Thai managed to, after we designated a certain CC engine in cars, that they did is created a CC engine, 1 cubic centimetre less, and got round the agreement. So there is a lot to be said, Roger, about the proficiency of the people who go to these trade agreements. And I'd say, Roger, that there is no such thing as a free trade agreement. It's a euphemistic term for a bilateral trade agreement. There's no trade agreement where people at the end of it say, well, that's it, all laws are gone. We both deal without any encumbrances whatsoever on the entry and exit of products between the two countries. So, but Roger, the reality of the world is that if we don't enter into these bilateral trade agreements, then we can be left at a disadvantage to other countries. And you can have a look at New Zealand, for instance, who's turned itself into basically the Saudi Arabia of milk. And you know, what they are doing, and I borrowed that from one of my colleagues who asked me for the copyright on it, and his name's Malcolm. But so you've got to have a real sense of competency in it, Roger. But if we were to say, oh, well, that being the case, we're just not going to enter into any agreement with anybody, then all that'll happen is we'll just get left behind.
So can I just ask quickly, why do you call it a free trade agreement with China if it isn't one?
Well, it just seems to be the custom and practice that goes be
Freer trade.
Yeah, freer trade might be better, but I just think it's...
Would you urge the Prime Minister to stop calling it a free trade agreement?
I think most people, especially in the audience, understand that if you can nominate one true free trade agreement, then stick up your hand. Oh, here's Roger.
I mean, I don't want my children to be cow farmers. Yeah. I'd like to have a choice, maybe to design cars or go into aeronautics and things like that. Now, you're taking multiple disciplines out of Australia over recent years with these free trade policies, and I don't think it doesn't appear you've got any overarching plan other than to have a dry philosophy of opening up the economy. Now, we all don't want to be wheat farmers, we don't want to be cow farmers like the New Zealanders, and we want to produce more interesting things than that. Yeah. Otherwise, what are you going to do with 23 million people?
Well, Roger,
we could become the New Zealander of oil.
Yeah. Well, Roger, what I think is really important is what I say to my department and in my discussions, I said, your number one goal is a better return at the farm gate. Make that your goal. And if we get a better return at the farm gate, then from that will come a capacity to a better standard of living, greater capacity to enjoy the fundamentals of life, and also people will be more inclined to increase their farm production, which apparently is going to be one of our great opportunities in Southeast Asia in the coming decade. So now how we do that, Roger, is on multiple levels, and a vital part of it, of course, is making sure that people buy our products, and that's why I've been happy in the last month. We've got an extra 75,000 head of cattle moving into Indonesia. That's a good step in the right direction. And if we do a range of things like that, we can start bringing a better return back to the farm gate.
Let's hear from our other panellists. Rabia, Siddique.
Can I just make a point on free trade? And that is that the Abbott government have made it very clear early on that one of their priorities is economic growth for this country, and I agree that it is a very important priority. However, whether you call it free trade or bilateral trade agreements, one thing that I think we need to be very careful of is that we don't compromise our commitments and our values. Some of our partners in these so-called free trade agreements have a very dubious and worrying history in things like human rights abuses. And my concern as a human rights lawyer, of course, is that we don't just focus on economic growth in the next 3 to 5 to 7 years at the risk and at the compromise of our commitments and adherence to international law and human rights.
Amanda Vanstone.
Well, I wouldn't mix the two. I'd keep freer trade discussions, what you want to call them, bilateral trade discussions.
It's interesting we can no longer talk about free trade talks because we're not going to have a free trade agreement. That's been now
anyway,
stated.
I'd keep that separate from the arguments that you want to have or the discussions or awareness-raising issues that you want to have with other countries about human rights. I am very anxious about any country that wants to go around poking other ones, telling them where they're going wrong. That's not to say there's not a role for us, there is, in one of the great Western democracies, a very peaceful, stable country, in using the resources we can through foreign affairs to demonstrate where people could do a much better job in the human rights area. But I'd keep it separate from free trade agreements. And, you know, if you keep saying you want... when I was a kid, I'm 60, so there's a long time ago, people would say, if every Chinese person would just buy one pair of woolen socks, we'd all be filthy rich. Yeah, well, you know, if you want them to buy our socks, you've got to buy some of their stuff. It just doesn't work that you can keep saying oh, we're going to put barriers up to protect our stuff, but we want you to buy our gear. You've got to work both ways.
Tony Burke.
Australia's an exporting nation. Normally, and one of the reasons why these agreements often go slower than we want is often it is the case that we've got more at stake than the country we're negotiating with. But we're an exporting nation, and protectionist comments can often be really smart politically, but I think you'll see as you watch things like the GrainCorp decision unfold in the coming weeks, which Joe Hockey will have to make, that the new government will recognise that foreign investment's important and will recognise that Australia, even when there might be a negative side seen to some aspects of trade, overwhelmingly, we do better out of it.
Can I just say, we might be an exporting trade, but we also are very much a country that enjoys cheap imports. And we have a lot of imported goods that are made in China, and that's how we keep a lot of prices down. And I disagree with respect to Amanda. I don't think we can keep the issue of human rights and free trade separate, because by agreeing to enter into trade agreements with countries, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, but by agreeing to enter into trade agreements with countries like China and keeping the issue of human rights separate, isn't there a risk that we would become complicit in some of these human rights breaches? And that's the danger.
Well, it is true that a lot of products are actually produced in Chinese gulags, so you do have a point there. But we have to move on. We've got a lot of questions to cover. The next one comes from Talia Stump.
Good evening, panellists. Speaking of human rights, the Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison, now wants to further shift the discourse on asylum seekers by instructing they be publicly referred to as illegals and detainees. What does the panel think about how this may influence community attitudes toward asylum seekers and the impact it will have on asylum seekers who are already living in our community? To what extent is this change in terminology a strategy in stopping the boats, or is it simply a reflection of political opinion?
Let's start with Vince Sorrenti.
Yeah, illegals. Look, I'm very disappointed because I think Australia is a nation of sledges, and surely we can do better than illegals. These are dirty, rotten, low-down, possible terrorists, you know, third-world bastards. You know, so I think we should have the cricket team like lined up outside detention centres, like hurling abuse at these people who have such a high esteem. You know. No, I think it's bad. I think we should be treating these people as human beings that they are. And look, I've got a very extreme view about illegal arrivals. I think we should open the floodgates, but that's my personal opinion. I think we should have a 100,000 a year limit and let these people come in and use them to our advantage. Let them live where we tell them to live, and do something for our country.
Barnaby, Joyce, that is, in effect, that's the Clive Palmer solution.
Well, there's an interesting caveat. You let them live where we tell them to live. I mean, straight away you're making conditions on it. But
let's go back to the question, though. Scott Morrison said today he's just calling a spade a spade.
Well, if a person arrives here by a form that does not allow us immediate processing of them, which they have to have, if you fly into this country, there is a form of processing you have to go through. But if you arrive here by boat, we have really no idea about the destination. We have to go through a more diligent form of processing, and that form of arrival is illegal.
Why is it important to make the change from irregular arrivals to illegals? What sort of point are you actually making there? Are you actually trying to send, as a government, trying to send out specific message to the community?
Yeah, we are. We're sending out a very set message that if you decide to take the journey to Australia through a process that involves a person trafficking human misery across borders, then we will not take you in. You will not be dealt with as a person who ends up living in this country. We will continue to take in vast numbers of people who live in the camps of the Thai-Burma border or in Northern Africa, but you will go through the process that is determined by the government, not on the process determined by the human trafficker.
Rabia Siddique.
I think it's disappointing, and I think it's embarrassing, and I think it's inflammatory, and I think that it is politicising this issue, and I think that it is furthering this hysteria and this obsession with stopping the boats. And most upsettingly, I think that it is ignoring and devaluing and disregarding the horror and the misery that a lot of these people have gone through that's got them to the point where getting on a boat, even at risk of death, is insignificant compared to what they've been through. And I think it is reprehensible. Can I just say that Minister Morrison has directed that all public servants refer to these individuals, to asylum seekers now, as illegal maritime illegal maritime arrivals, and also refer to them as detainees, as you've said, Talia, and not clients. I am a public servant. I will not be referring to them in such a manner.
Amanda Vanstone.
Well, look, much is said about this. The UN protocol on people smuggling, as I understand it, refers to that as facilitating the illegal entry into a state by a person without going through the proper processes. That's the UN protocol. It's not something someone else has made up. The UN protocol describes people smuggling, as I'm told, as facilitating the...
But it doesn't actually describe the people on board as illegals, so that's where the change has been made.
No, but the UN uses this language to describe what people smugglers do. They facilitate the illegal entry into a state by other people, and they define that as being...
Do you think do you personally, as a former immigration minister, believe that the people on those boats are illegals?
I think they have a right to come here and seek asylum. I personally think that the treaty on asylum seeking should be changed. I don't think it was ever intended when it first was put together that people would go through 3 or 4 other countries saying, well, that one doesn't suit me, that one doesn't suit me, I'm going to pick this one. It wasn't intended to do that. And technology and air travel has become so much easier now that people can now, in a sense, forum shop for where they're going to land. As I understand it, what Mr Morrison's done is said if you want to refer to the way they've arrived, they are illegal, unauthorised boat arrivals. But they'll still be called asylum seekers in the context of, well, what are they doing? Well, they're seeking asylum. It's a plain fact. That's how the UN refers to it. I don't think you dress it up anyway. And if I may say, I don't like to see anyone in a desperate situation where they want to get out of where they're living. But I do recognise that there are countries, many countries, with people in that situation, and I do not have more sympathy for those who've got the money to pay a people smuggler than I do for people in camps who haven't got the money to pay a people smuggler. That doesn't make you, Rabia, any more compassionate than me. In fact, if you really want to roll the dice, I'd say what we should be doing is organising the system we used to have, which was an orderly arrangement for handling refugees, where we work with the UN every year to work out where the people are most in need. That's why we took thousands of Kosovos at one time, because it was needed. More people from Sudan, because it was needed. We took an awful lot of Vietnamese as well, and they came here on boats. Sure.
Can I hear from Tony Burke?
We're a country probably you could describe us as almost first asylum for them, but we're not for people from the Middle East.
Tony Burke.
I think Scott Morrison would be loving this debate, absolutely loving it, because he's put something out there that is about the language, and suddenly there's a whole conversation going across the country about is he being too tough and being too mean. And if you want evidence that he would love that this debate's happening, he even gave interviews today. He even appeared and gave interviews instead of only doing it once a week. In terms of the language, one of the terms he changed is the term client. Now, my recollection is the term client was introduced when Amanda Vanstone was the minister, is my recollection, following Palmer and Connery. Starting to refer to people as clients certainly was being used in your media
Actually, client sounds rather Orwellian anyway, doesn't it?
Well, I don't think you'll ever come up with a perfect term where you've got somebody in a confined environment while you're working out, going through the security checks when people first arrive. He's just referring
now to detainees, which seems to make more sense, really. Yeah.
Well, detainees would connote that they were awaiting charge or trial.
Not in Australia, it doesn't.
I think, to be honest, I think the term client is a bit absurd. I mean, I'm an accountant. I know what clients look like, and they don't.
Well, they don't come to you in boats. Is that what you're saying?
Basically. Yeah.
Tony Burke, Richard Marles said today there's a political purpose behind this change. If that's true, what is it?
The political purpose is to have a debate about how tough the new government is. Because what's happening is, for what they're implementing right now, they're not towing boats back to Indonesia. They're not following through the promise they gave that they go around buying boats in Indonesian fishing villages. What they're doing is implementing the regional resettlement arrangements. That's what they're doing.
Oh,
but they
right.
want to look like they're being really tough. So they've decided to play a game with the language, and all of a sudden Scott Morrison, who won't answer a question about what's actually happening in Australia, what's happening to people seeking asylum, will answer a question about what language is going to be used. They are loving this debate.
Well, can I just make a point? Look, you had a policy that I understand your offshore processing didn't have funding past December. You didn't even have places for people who were judged to be a refugee in Nauru or in Papua New Guinea to then move to and live. So, and your party, not talking about you personally, was a part of a party that disparaged uphill and down dale every policy the Howard government had in this area, and then subsequently chose to implement them. So forgive me if I don't, you know, put a lot of a lot of thought on that now. In your time,
if you're brief, you can continue with this. I want to.
Well, it will be brief. They had two rescues and handovers to the Indonesians in your entire time. As I understand it, the current government's had 2 in the last, 5 or 6 weeks.
Yes, but they won't tell us how it actually happened.
They will tell you.
No, they won't.
Once a week.
They didn't tell us. No. I'm sorry, you're wrong about that. They did have their briefing and they refused to discuss it. Right. You're watching Q&A. We've got a few subjects to talk about. Our next question comes from Danica Shane.
West Australian Liberal Don Randall has repaid more than $5,000 for a trip to Cairns with his wife, yet he has still not explained to the Australian taxpayer how this so-called oversight could have occurred. Tony Abbott himself has said that the rules governing the entitlements that MPs are allowed to correctly claim are not always clear. At one stage, he himself regarded the costs incurred to attend the private wedding of a colleague as a correctly claimed entitlement. How can the Australian people possibly feel at ease with the entrusting of a $1.6 trillion economy to politicians with such poor discernment and ethical standards?
Let's start with Vince Sorrenti.
Yeah, I love this concept that you can just give the money back. It's okay. Oops, sorry, you got me. Here's your $20,000 back. You know. Hey, oops, sorry, I robbed that 7-Eleven last night. Here's your $400 back. You know. I mean, at least Silvio Berlusconi paid for his own Bunga Bunga parties. Now, Amanda, did you go to one or not? I need to know. You know.
Whose money did he pay with, you want to ask?
Barnaby Joyce.
Yeah, I thought it was going to end up with me. Look, first of all, the first thing I'd say is in regards to study tours, studies tours are actually approved before you go. So the idea that you do something and then claim it back is not correct. These things are approved before you go.
I don't think Don Randall with his $5,000 on a study tour.
But then
wasn't he on an investment tour?
I'm not. Then the next thing is with the process of what was within the guidelines. And what actually makes it past the front page of the paper are 2 vastly different things, and I acknowledge that. And whenever it ends up in an issue where you're trying to explain something, you just are going to lose every time. For instance, I arrived here tonight in a car, in a Commonwealth car, in the dreaded Commonwealth car. I don't know whether explicitly in the guidelines I'm allowed to do that, right? It's an assumption that I'm allowed to do that. Later on, I will go upstairs with Tony and the rest of the guests and we'll have a beer. Is that correct?
No, because we don't have an upstairs.
Oh, well. We'll go.
We'll go to the casino on that car.
Just hear me out. We'll go beside here and I imagine we'll have a beer or a glass of wine. So then it becomes a social function. And then I will stay in a hotel tonight, which definitely the taxpayer will pay for. Now, if you wanted to, tomorrow in the paper you could read, caught a Comcar, and here's a stupid photo of me and Tony having a beer together and stayed in this hotel, front page, and I wouldn't even bother arguing against it. Just say, oh, well, take me to your leader. I came second in that one.
But people might make the error of judgment to think that you'd actually come here to discuss government policy.
But, well, then, so what do? Do we pro-rata it? I mean, so the whole thing becomes a vagary where rightly we are held to account because it is your money. I totally acknowledge that. We have to be completely and utterly diligent. But it is, if people want to become more refined in how it's dealt with, I'm all for that. But if you work within the guidelines and you do something that is legal, then and we're never going to win this debate. You get held up for because it just doesn't look right.
Barnaby, you did win the debate in one sense, and that you actually claimed you saved the taxpayers' money by flying to India in Gina Rinehart's private aeroplane.
Well, no, OK, no, that's fair enough, but let's deal with this. the taxpayer did not pay for me to go to that wedding. And that was always the assumption that they show all the festivities, which is part of how you do business in Southeast Asia. I acknowledge that. That's all part of it. But the taxpayer didn't pay for that.
But you had to get back again. There's the trick. And they did pay for that.
But that was pre-approved. Before I went, that trip to Malaysia was approved. Right. I decided to take it as I came back.
OK, Rabia, Siddique, how does this look to a lawyer? Not specifically this story, but the general picture.
Dodgy? I agree absolutely with you, Danica. You know, we elect our government and our ministers, and we expect them to not only be leaders, but to be example setters. They have a responsibility to do so. They need to be transparent, they need to be whiter than white, and they need to be accountable. They do have the luxury, you know, as Vince made a serious point in his joke, and that, you know, they have the luxury of when they're caught out, they can give it back. But it shouldn't get to that. And as I've said before, you know, I work for the government and I have to account for every dollar that I spend and that I use and that I apply for. And why should that be any different for the office of a minister?
Amanda Vanstone.
I wrote a very nice piece for The Age on this today. I highly recommend it to you.
Shameless plug.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, my understanding from 23 years in Parliament is that most people don't cheat. Mal Colston was a very serious exception to that. And most people rarely make a mistake. So I think part of this is a shame to judge everybody by people who have apparently done the wrong thing. There was an inquiry set up under the Howard government called the Belcher Inquiry. Ms Belcher was a very respected and long-standing public servant in the Prime Minister and Cabinet. One of the recommendations I understand she made was for a bit more transparency, and transparency can cure many, many ills. So I support the recommendation that the claims should have to be published, and instead of just saying, well, it's electorate or what, parliamentary or vice-regal or something, I think it's fair enough to say health policy, 4 meetings, and publish them monthly on websites in an easy and accessible format so that politicians have to answer to the public for what they've done. Now, having said that, there's a good reason sometimes why someone will want to say, I went to Sydney, for example, and no, I can't tell you who I had a meeting with because it's confidential. If a whistleblower, for example, definitely does not want you to tell them that they're dobbing in crooked cops or whatever. But that would be okay to allow someone to put confidential meeting because they couldn't put it every month. It would just look ridiculous. So I think some more transparency is never a bad thing, and it will help for the few, and they are a few, who cheat or make mistakes.
Amanda, sorry, go ahead.
But that includes the current Prime Minister of Australia. I mean, going to a private wedding, where is that grey? It was a private wedding. How can that be a work-related job?
Well, I did think that I should have gone back into the old papers and thought, now, Bill Shorten was married a couple of years ago. I might go and have a look and see how many people went to that. I've not claimed to go to a wedding using an allowance. But the difficult area is people put in a claim and it's regarded as acceptable, and then they can... It's not quite the same as robbing a bank because it's regarded as acceptable under the guidelines, but then when there's a public fuss about it, someone says, I don't want the fuss, I'll just pay the money back. It's a little bit different. Not entirely, but a little bit different.
Very quick follow-up question. How do you suppose the News Limited tabloids would have responded to this scandal if it had been a Labor government coming into power?
News Limited at this point in time.
The same way the Fairfax ones responded to it with us coming into government.
So you acknowledge you have your friends and your enemies.
Tony, have you ever had to repay claims?
I made the mistake of I had claims that were within the guidelines but beyond a cap that used to exist, and I'd misread the cap once I found out that it appeared in the media 7 years later.
So how much did you repay?
Oh, and this was the mistake. I repaid more than they asked, so now I get told. Now all that appears is I repaid in the order of $7,000. Whereas at the time I was thinking, no, they want me to repay, I'm going to go much more than what they've said and get right under, which has turned out to make it a bigger story.
So Tony repaid $7,000, but I don't think Tony's a criminal.
My only stuff up was an underclaim.
This gentleman with his hand up in the middle there.
I nearly threw up in the gutter when someone rang to say it was a mistake.
We'll quickly go to that young man who's got his hand up in the middle there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, do you think there needs to be some sort of more severe consequences for public servants that break the rules? Like you suggested there needs to be for arsonists, like as if they're thinking rationally.
Oh, well, I'm always in favour of transparency for starters, and I think you'll find that if you have transparency, this area will clean itself up very, very quickly. Because if you have to answer to your electorate, you know, net-savvy people in the electorate, and they're not only young people these days, you know, the grey lot are into this, I think you'll fix it up pretty quick. And there are consequences.
Easy on the grey lot.
You just can't see mine because it's dark.
OK, I'm going to second that and move on to our next question, which is from Kirk Colmeyer.
In response to Nicola Roxon's speech last week, I noted that a spokesman for Kevin Rudd said that Kevin was busy overseas developing policies for Australia's future. My question is, does this line that he was developing policies for Australia's future indicate that he was looking for, perhaps to stay in politics for the full term, or maybe have another tilt at the Labor leadership in the future?
Let's start with Vince Sorrenti on this.
How would you ask him? No, don't ask him!
Well, we will go to him. And he was
That's a great
comment. He was just talking a moment ago.
Vince should have something in depth about this. What do you reckon, Vince?
Well, mate, he is still the elephant in the room, really. And like, despite the fact that Bill Shorten has announced a new cabinet, a new shadow ministry, the one thing that's still there on the backbench is Kevin Rudd. And
by the way, Nicola Roxon did not describe him as an elephant.
No. I think, and look, Bill Shorten said he was putting together a Gen X sort of a shadow ministry. Well, you've got a baby boomer sitting in the backbench, and we know how baby boomers love to stuff up the lives of Gen Xers.
What I love about this is what the Labor Party gives you is options, because you can have Bill Shorten's front bench or Albo's front bench, or if in doubt, you can have Kevin's front bench. They're all there.
Rabia.
I don't have a lot to say about this, except to say that whatever Mr Rudd decides to do, I suppose, is down to Mr Rudd. However, I believe that he has had his opportunity twice, and I think that for the good of his party, because he said he is committed to the good of his party, that perhaps he should honourably and gracefully bow down and allow his successor to move forward.
Look, I think that the big thing is, if he is overseas developing policies for our nation, the only way he can implement them is if he becomes a leader again.
Let's hear from Tony Burke on this. So you've had, Nicola Roxon's not alone, you've had a few harsh words in the past about Kevin Rudd yourself. Do you think he should now step out of politics?
He's been elected. He said he didn't want to go on the front bench. He's doing work as a Member of Parliament. Everything that I felt a couple of years ago that I needed to say, I've said, it's done. The rest of the country is willing to move on. I think we ought to just move on with the discussion as well and treat him with the respect as a former leader and former Prime Minister and leave it at that.
So Nicola Roxon got it quite wrong, apparently, did she?
I'd never deliver a speech like that.
Mm. Why do you think she did? Because here was the Labor Party sailing along, looked like they've got a new leader, looking ahead, and there's Nicola Roxon comes out and calls the former leader a bastard.
Look, I took great promise from the opening lines of that speech, where Nicola made clear that she was going to make that speech once, and that was going to be it. And I'm not going to now spend the next year remaking it for her. Let's just move on.
Well, I like the cartoon that had, like, the fire hose. There was Kevin Rudd strapped in, and the little thing at the bottom, break in case of emergency. You know, he does want to come out and have another go. I thought, I understand your point about Nicola's speech. I might feel the same way if it was my party and someone did that. But she did raise a very interesting prospect in that speech. What she said is that the Cabinet at the time, of which you remember, understood what a disaster this was and did nothing about it, and queried, you know, why they couldn't bring themselves to act as a Cabinet and bring their Prime Minister into line. So in that context, she cast a light on one aspect of the debate that hasn't perhaps had the coverage that it should. But look, in the end, I agree with Rabia. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think he's had his go and he should shove off.
OK, let's go to next question. It's from Kylie Harris.
My question is for Amanda Vanstone. Recently, you defended the Liberal Party's cabinet, including only one woman, stating, "I'd rather have a good government than more women in the cabinet for the sake of it." Why do you believe there aren't more women that could contribute to a good government? And what could be done to change this unequal representation of women in the highest level of politics that wouldn't be considered just doing it for the sake of it?
Amanda, we'll just ask for brief answers here, if you don't mind, because we're running out of time.
OK. Look, one of the great things about being out of politics is it happens less that you're taken out of context. I did say that, but I didn't say that what had happened was fine. I said it was regrettable that there should have been more women, that what I would have done is made a bit of trimming at the top in cabinet. That would have allowed some junior ministers to move up and some more people to come in as parliamentary secretaries. You know, I think I went as far as saying that I probably would have given McFarlane the industry portfolio instead of Mirabella. Because I think if you're charged with the job of picking a cabinet, you have to pick the best. And I think McFarlane's better suited to industry than Mirabella ever would have been. I would like to see more women, but it is a fact that if you ask me, would I prefer to have more women or a competent government, I'll choose the latter. That's not a complete and unmitigated support for having one woman in cabinet. There should be more.
Rabia Siddique.
I could say a lot about this because I have some very strong views about it, but time is short, so I won't.
No, you can say a bit.
Oh, OK. Get comfortable. You know, research has shown that some of the most successful and efficient corporations and governments around the country, around the world, have at least 30% women on their executive boards and on their inner cabinet. And I think Mr Rabbit has really missed a good opportunity there. I think as women we bring something very different to the table. We approach policy and decisions and governance differently. We bring a balance. And I think, with respect to Amanda's argument about I'd rather see a more competent government than a more female government, I think that harks back to that, that old adage about it should be about merit, not about gender proportion. That's fine if the decision makers around the table that are deciding meritorious candidates weren't all blokes.
Barnaby, Joyce. Were you actually surprised to find yourself in a cabinet which actually looks very much, with one exception, like a boys' club?
Well, if someone was to select you to a position, you want to believe that you've got it because you're the best person for the job, not because of your gender or because of your religion or because of any other aspect of your personal or physical person.
Can I just ask this quickly? Do you see any coalition women out there who are poised to enter the cabinet?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. I mean,
so there must be some with merit right now.
Well,
I do, and into the junior ministry and as PAL 6. I'll give you a list.
My deputy is Fiona Nash. I think Fiona Nash is incredibly capable, and you know, Fiona and I have been a really strong team all the way through. I see, you know, always the progression of people through. I see the roles in politics as things that ebb and flow with time, and as people of certain capabilities come up, they will go forward. I honestly do not see the selection based on the sex of the candidate. I see it based on the capabilities, and as they present, people get selected. The vast majority of my staff have always been women. They continue to be women. The vast majority of the department and the high executive, high executive positions in my department, I think the overwhelmingly female. I just don't. I would think it was pretty. A bit of an insult to a person to say, well, you're not actually the best candidate for this job, but you are of a certain sex, therefore we gave it to you.
Have you actually blocked the path of a future Margaret Thatcher?
Which one?
She won't be blocked.
No.
Don't worry about that. If there's a Margaret Thatcher there, she'll get there.
I don't. I just think that people will progress in our nation because of their capabilities, and that's the sort of nation I want.
But I think that's the problem. Like, the worst thing about the makeup of that cabinet isn't that it's only one woman, it's that it actually didn't reflect merit. Like, you can't look across the blokes across there and say that all of them are better than Fiona Nash. You can't look across the people across the whole of the executive and say all of those blokes are better than Kelly O'Dwyer.
Well,
it's just not... No. You've had a go.
Says the bloke at the other end of the table.
Yeah.
Well, and says, don't you think it was slightly hypocritical? You had Bill Shorten out there and Albanese talking about why we didn't have enough women. Correct me if I'm wrong, they're both blokes.
Yeah, you're on a very different argument to me on this. If you think that's the king hit, Barnaby, the challenge here is when you look at that executive, was it made on merit? And yeah, it shouldn't be my job to go through praising members of the National Party, members of the Liberal Party, but I can see no shortage of women on your side of politics who should have been promoted further than they were.
Just a second, we've got a hand, it's just shot up. We're nearly out of time, but I'll quickly go to you.
Mr. Joyce, girls are consistently outperforming the boys at high school and at tertiary level as well. What you've just said, you'd prefer to see people be placed in positions purely based on merit and not because of any, any particular characteristic they have. That's a mantra of the die-hard opponents to affirmative action in the US, and it's quite unfortunate that you say that.
Well, I'll take that as a comment.
Amanda Vanstone wants to make a final comment.
Well, look, I would like to see more women, and I might have chosen differently, as I said, at the cabinet level and the outer ministry level. But Cathy Sullivan, a former senator from Queensland, shifted down to the lower house, had a great line when some old fuddy-duddy old geezer said to her, I think people should be chosen on merit. A bloke follows, fuddy-duddy old geezer. I think they should be chosen on merit. And Cathy looked up and said, really? How did you get here?
Barnaby, that wasn't directed at you. We're running out of time. We've got time for one more quick question. It's a video. It's from Paul Hirayama in Cairns, Queensland.
Ben Sorrenti, as a comedian, are you struggling for material now that we have a silent government?
More material, please, mate. Come on. Well, I anticipated this, which is why I voted for Clive Palmer. He's got everything, Clive. You get a lot of bang for your buck with Clive, mate. You got conspiracy theories, you got the CIA, you got dinosaurs. He's rebuilding the Titanic. Every iceberg in the world is going, bring it on, son. I would have voted for Bozo the Clown if he was running, so...
I think that's probably time for us to leave the program for tonight because we have run out of time. Please thank our panel, Vince Sorrenti, Barnaby Joyce, Rabia Siddique, Amanda Vanstone and Tony Burke. Thank you very much. And next Monday, we will be joined by a panel including the Minister for Education, Christopher Pyne, Shadow Minister for Agriculture, Joel Fitzgibbon, journalist and author Ray Martin, and opinion columnist for The Australian, Janet Albrechtsen. So until then, good night.